Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ilva Tare, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Europe Center. It is a pleasure to have you with us, whether in person or online, here in Washington, D.C. or abroad. Thank you all for joining this event. What can the U.S. learn from Europe about support for Ukraine, co-hosted by the Atlantic Council's Euro-Asia Center and Europe Center. The title of today's conversation perhaps raises few eyebrows. I know it did mine. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is now in its third year. Ukraine and its people need help now more than ever. The United States is Ukraine's largest supporter of military aid and has provided billions in humanitarian assistance and support to the government. However, U.S. aid has stalled. A $60 billion aid package has sat in Congress for months as Ukrainians run short of ammunition and supplies. While U.S. support withers, Europe have stepped up. The EU and its members together account for the largest aid to Ukraine in gross terms of financial, humanitarian, and military support. And the support comes from humble beginnings. We remember early in the war when Europe offered helmets. Now, European countries send tanks, artillery shells, and soon, fighter jets. In the past few months, many European countries and the EU have stepped up in creative ways to support Ukraine's defense and counter Russia's war of aggression, including French President Emmanuel Macron's recent bold statement in support of Ukraine and the Czech initiative spearheaded by Czech President Petr Pavel to find, purchase and transfer much-needed ammunition to the front lines of Ukraine. So what can Europe teach the United States about support to Ukraine? Can it at all? We will unpack these questions and hopefully more today. We're pleased to be joined in person by a great group of speakers, including Jan Havranek, the Deputy Chief Mission at the Embassy of Czech Republic in Washington, D.C. Welcome.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Havranek.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here. We'll be joined by Benjamin Haddad. He's joining us virtually from Paris, or I don't know where you are, Ben, member of National Assembly of France. Thank you for joining us. I'm joined by Deborah Keegan, Senior Advisor at the Euro-Asia Center. Thank you, Deborah. A pleasure to have you here today. And Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Euro-Asia Center. To our audience, make sure to submit your questions at askac.org and follow us online at X, at AC Europe, at AC Euro-Asia. With that, Jan, I would like to begin with you the first question. As I said, Czech President was a hero at the Munich conference, security conference, when he mentioned Czech efforts to find ammunition on international markets and called on funding to ensure that ammunition can be bought and provided to Ukraine. Subsequently, over 10 countries have agreed to buy and fund more than 1.5 million rounds for Ukraine. What is the status of this initiative, and why did President Pavel propose it?
Sure. Indeed, he became a hero of the Munich Security Conference, but as a former general and chief of defense, he definitely is a hero to many of us. But his announcement provided a very critical moment of leadership, an example of leadership at a moment when, as we all know, deliveries of weapons to Ukraine from Europe and the United States have become increasingly more and more difficult, with European stocks being depleted. So it was my country and the leadership that gathered around a system that we've been actually devising since day one and even before the war began. And we looked outside of Europe to find additional sources of ammunition. So since that day, we've been able to gather up to around 20 countries. So doubled since the recent announcement and identified currently 800,000 rounds of ammunition, artillery ammunition, sitting around the globe, so to say. I will not be very specific about those countries. And we've also embarked upon a very ambitious fundraising initiative, and we've been very fortunate. So it has become a Czech ammunition initiative, but it is a concerted effort by around 20 European countries, plus Canada, I should say, just to show leadership and to show really also here to the United States that we're in this together and that Europe is taking its own security and its neighborhood very seriously.
When will Ukraine see this ammunition arriving?
Some of them relatively soon. Some of them are being delivered as we speak. And again, we're not talking about we're talking about security and defense. We're talking about very sensitive material. So I don't want to be too specific on any of the timelines or numbers. But as I said previously, we've been working on this system both logistically through our defense industrial networks and government networks that we're able to do this in an expedition. We're talking about weeks to short number of months for the first deliveries.
Ben, President Macron has also taken a new leading role in this debate on Russia's war on Ukraine, such as his discussion of the use of French troops or a possible air cap in western Ukraine. How serious are these proposals in your view, and what are the reasons that he proposed it?
You know, I just got back from Kyiv and Odessa, where I was last week with the Speaker of our Parliament. And it's clear to us that the war is at a turning point and 2024 is going to be critical. Today, the Russians strike and use 10 times as many ammunitions as Ukrainians on the ground. You have cities like Kyiv and Odessa, whose infrastructure and water and energy are under constant strike. And of course, for us Europeans, we see questions arising coming from the United States, with the supplemental being hung in Congress, and of course, the questions for the next election. And then, you know, the question for us is, well, are we ready, and can we put the effort, can we rise to this moment and help Ukraine win this war, even, which we do not hope, even without the United States? And this is the question that President Macron has asked, and he made it very clear that this war is existential for us Europeans. If tomorrow Russia were able to conquer Ukraine, it would be at the doorstep of the Baltic states, of Poland, of Romania, with dramatic consequences for our security. And so this is why he decided to launch this initiative, bringing together heads of states and prime ministers to Paris, first and foremost, to see everything that we can do to step up our effort. And you know, one of the key elements of this is, of course, supporting the Czech initiative that we just mentioned, but seeing anything that we can do in terms of long-range missiles, ammunition, trying to help states that want to do more but don't have the capabilities to replace them. So see how different states in Europe can help each other. And then he was asked a question about whether sending troops at some point would be excluded. And he said, we don't exclude anything. And the truth is, for the last 2 years, we've kept on telling Putin our red lines, our limits. We've kept on negotiating with ourselves and deterring ourselves when we have in front of us a Russian leader who has put no such limit, no such red line on his own behavior and his aggression against Ukraine. And so this is the moment to turn the table on him, to put red lines, to start deterring Russia and pushing back against its aggression, and stop doing this to ourselves. This is what President Macron said, and you know, he's trying to, I would say, shake Europeans out of complacency. You know, at the end of the day, us French have been saying for years that Europeans need to take more ownership on security and defense, that we need to push for our own strategic autonomy, or however you want to call it. But the idea is that we need to take security issues seriously. Well, this is the test. We have a war of aggression on our continent, as direct security consequences on the security architecture of Europe. And I would say that just the well-being of European citizens, it's time for us to step up.
And Deborah, you have been a long-time practitioner and observer in big politics, power politics. As an American, how do you characterize administration policy towards the war? And what is the impact of Republican blockage of the next aid package to Ukraine?
Thank you very much. And I'm going to pick up on what Jan and Ben have just said. And I'm going to start by saying, in war, never telegraph to your enemy what you won't do. It is like giving your enemy an advantage. And so picking up on what my colleagues just said, is this totally undermines the concept of deterrent. So as much as deterrence as NATO has, if allies has, as the United States has, when you convey to Putin, who is your enemy, he's not your adversary, he's your enemy, what you won't do, that gives Putin a lot of leeway to take even more violent, more destructive, more murderous intentions and effects, because he does not think you're going to respond, because you've already told him you're not going to do certain things. So my reaction now is that I'm going to borrow a word from my colleague John Herbst of timidity, that you still have a White House that is still timid and still a little too much afraid of Putin and what he can and cannot do. And because of that, we have been very slow and almost too plodding in our efforts to supply Ukraine. And yes, this blockage of this aid is really significant, but to be honest with you, aircraft should have gone to Ukraine a year ago. Long-range fighters should have gone to Ukraine a year ago. We shouldn't have been arguing about even giving them Javelin, weapons 3 weeks into the conflict. So part of the problem is one that we've created by not giving Ukraine what it would need it to thwart Russia. It was enough to keep them alive, but not to win. And the U.S. would never send its own military into conflict under those circumstances. Never. It would not happen. Couple of other dynamics here on this. If this funding aid does not go forward, it will be devastating. I compliment our European colleagues who I think are doing more and creating a much bigger burden than they ever have in the past 40 years in terms of burden sharing. But we need a compendium of all of our defense industry on this, not just U.S. defense industry, but it has to be a cooperative approach to this, not a competitive approach. So for too long, we've been ruled by competition and protectionism, and we need to understand that these are our allies now. We need to work together so that Ukraine can defeat Russia and the rest of Europe is safe from Russians' desires.
Ambassador Herbst, what's your assessment of the dynamic between the U.S. and the key European players in driving Western policy in response to Moscow's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, of course, there's 75 or more years of American leadership in the West. First in World War II, and then, of course, in creating the post-war world. And early in my career, I saw how essential strong American leadership was when the Reagan administration insisted on deploying intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe, despite reservations in many of the European countries, in response to the Soviet deployment of comparable missiles in Western Russia, Western Soviet Union. Sadly, what we see today is a truly peculiar and dangerous synergy between a timid administration and quasi-isolationists, Republican naïves, who don't understand that Putin, no less than Xi, is coming for American interests. And that while China is the greater danger in the long run, because China, unlike Russia, has a working economy, Russia's the one who's pursuing major war at the present time. And even if we're worried about China, the best way to deter Chinese aggression is to soundly defeat Putin in Ukraine. Now, that's all as a prelude to talking about what's happening between the United States and key European countries. Sadly, the White House has found a spiritual partner in the Chancery. And American timidity is at least matched, if not exceeded, by German timidity, despite the so-called Zeitenwende. The good news, though, is that the Brits have kept an upper lip since the beginning of the big invasion. Boris Johnson, more than any Western statesman, encouraged the support Ukraine needed in the early months after the big invasion. And they set an example, which we partly, and only partly, and as Deborah said, slowly in a doddering fashion followed. And now, to my great satisfaction, we're seeing a similar but distinct effort coming from Paris. Yep. Deborah's absolutely right that it's unbecoming for a superpower. It undercuts a superpower's interests and leadership to be telling a country, a nuclear power that has identified the United States as its principal adversary, that we're not going to do X and we're not going to do Y, so Putin can sit comfortably as he considers his next abomination that he's going to visit on Ukraine. Macron is right when he says, well, maybe we need to put NATO troops, or maybe we need to put French troops in Ukraine. Give Putin something to worry about. You know, John F. Kennedy, said famously, ask not what your country could do for you, what you could do for your country. I think the appropriate paraphrase of that right now is, ask not what Putin can do to us, but what we can do to Putin. And sadly, that is not the approach of this White House. And that has the timid policy of the administration has given the quasi-isolationists their big argument against aiding Ukraine, which is, we're going to stumble into an Armageddon.
Why do you think the administration has taken this timid approach towards?
I had a professor in graduate school named John Roach, who was also a senior advisor to Lyndon Johnson. And he would say, when you're dealing with senior officials, psychology is history or destiny. So we have folks on the national security team now who have been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Not very well versed in the successful nuclear diplomacy of the United States starting in the early 50s, once it was clear Russia had the bomb, and who were not intimidated during the two Berlin crises in the late 50s and in '61, and of course during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You never had in the past senior American officials saying, well, we can't do X or we can't do Y because they may go nuclear. But we've heard that a dozen times in the last 2 years. A very bad look. There have been moments when we've had strong statements coming from the president, but sadly there have been moments when we've had just the opposite.
Yeah. Deborah, this is your reading too? We have folks that are intimidated by nuclear weapons?
Yeah,
threats?
Yes, very much so. I think for months now, we heard, including the most recent visit of National Security Advisor Sullivan to Ukraine, telling Ukraine, please, please, please stop hitting targets in Russia. And I was thinking to myself at the time, and it's something that France has invoked many times, is Article 51 of the UN Charter. And under Article 51 of the UN Charter, if you want to look at the UN as being legitimate in this, Ukraine has a perfect right of hitting targets in Russia that can deploy the means of war. And that means energy sites, and that means weapons depots, and that means aircraft and the like. And that's perfectly legitimate under Article 51. So to tell Ukraine to stop doing that is ridiculous, especially in light of what Russia's tried to do to destroy Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure. And so let me just hop into the details of what John was just saying. There is this extreme paranoia that Russia's going to deploy an Iskander missile with a nuclear warhead. It's a tactical nuclear weapon. Two NATO allies have been living across Iskanders for quite some time, Poland and Lithuania, because they're deployed in Kaliningrad. And it's really ironic to me, and I will paraphrase some of my NATO allies, colleagues who said, it's really ironic that we are less afraid of the Russians using a tactical nuclear weapon than those of you who live across the Atlantic. And that should not be the case. And we should not be afraid of a tactical nuclear weapon that may cause infinitely more harm to the Russian troops on the ground than it ever would to the Ukrainians.
Thank you, Deborah. Ben, President Macron's recent statement, though, have been welcomed by many, but they have also sparked some controversy and frustrations, notably from Berlin. How should Paris be coordinating its messaging with its European partners? And do you think that Macron's forward-leaning approach without consulting neighbors and allies might sometimes have an opposite effect by showcasing more divergence than the unity that everyone needs now from Europe?
Well, first, there was consultation and discussion about this. And once again, the president was answering a question and said there's no consensus about sending troops, but that there was no reason to exclude it right. I think if you look at the momentum over the support for Ukraine in the last 2 years, unity among allies and Europeans and the United States has been critical. But it's also been important sometimes for some countries to take the lead to push others and go where others didn't want to go. I remember when Polish and I think Lithuanian leaders went to visit President Zelensky in Kyiv at a moment when it was seen as extraordinarily risky and dangerous, and then many others followed. And then we needed countries to break taboos over sending tanks, long-range missiles, planes, and so forth. And so you do need, I think, countries to take the lead and bring forward others. And the truth is, when you look at the last few weeks, initially it was much said in the press, especially the French press, I would say, that France was isolated, but it's not the case. We've seen countries like Poland, the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, that have applauded the firmness that's coming out of Paris. And these are countries, by the way, that we should have listened to for years, that have felt very much abandoned by Paris, Berlin, and other capitals, by DC for some time, when they were warning us about the threat that was coming out of Vladimir Putin's regime. That's something that President Macron said in Bratislava in his speech last year. He said, we should have spent more time listening to you. The truth is, how much time have we wasted over the last 2 years? If we had given Ukrainians what they needed to reconquer their territory, to defend themselves early on, the tanks, the long-range missiles, the planes, think about the planes where they're still training pilots, how useful they would have been in leading the counteroffensive a few months ago. So, instead of worrying once again about Putin's escalation, when the truth is he has escalated, he's chosen aggression and he's put no limit on it, let's give Ukrainians the need to push back. As for Germany, I don't want to push into the narrative of disagreements among Europeans. The truth also is, I think we also have to appreciate the fact that Germany is doing a lot when you look at the mass of weapons. In absolute numbers, it is number one in Europe. I do hope that Germans will give the Taurus that the Ukrainians desperately need to be able to strike into occupied territory in Ukraine, the ammunition depots and so forth. I think they would go a long way into helping Ukrainians on the ground. But it's good to have other countries, I think, sometimes that push forward on specific issues.
On this French boldness, Jan, what's the Czech view?
No, personally speaking, I certainly appreciated President Macron's comments, because we need more leadership, we need more European leadership, and we need American leadership. I think that has been one of the lessons learned, which is the topic of our discussion here today from this war and this crisis, that no country, talking about America and Europe, can do this alone. And it has been sometimes painful to watch a lack of leadership over the course of the past 2 years in Europe. But I think over and over again, we've proven our ability to come together and to coordinate ourselves and continue the support, the much-needed support and assistance to Ukraine. And one more note on Macron's comments. Look, and John has said it. If for deterrence, and Deborah as well, for deterrence to work, we need ambiguity. I mean, we need the strategic ambiguity. We need strength. We need resources. We need the whole of a government approach. It should not be only up to the governments, but it should really be up to private industry as well. And I think they have shown throughout this war that they can deliver, and that they understand the critical importance of operating in a safe and secure environment. So I think we're now going through a new phase of renewing our deterrence.
And talking about deterrence, from a seat here in Washington, Deborah, what do you make of these European proposals to arm Ukraine and themselves? Will it be enough to turn the tide in Ukraine's favor, and will it be enough to build up reliable defense readiness on the continent?
So I was hoping you were going to ask me that, because I have some answers here. I want to say this. Other than countries like the Czechs and the ones who had to live in the neighborhood with Russia much closer, There was a position of going to a slack mode here in the United States and in Europe among defense industry and everyone else about this Cold War dividend. There were countries who, up until a year and a half, 2 years ago, who were on the list to be up next for deployment under the Rapid Reaction Force, everything was on paper. When it came time to have to deploy those forces, they didn't exist. I won't call out names of allies, but some who were supposed to deploy and do rotations in the Baltics couldn't put together more than 10 people with equipment, which is ridiculous. That is not how NATO should ever have operated. It's not how the EU should operate. So on the upside, what Russia has done, and I always used to say that no threshold so low that Putin won't trip over it and cause the opposite of what he wants. What Russia has done is wake up the world, and in particular the European and the North American part of the world, to understand that your way of sitting back and thinking everything was going to be okay was not okay. And it hasn't been okay for a long time, and you have to do something about it. So I would argue that the leadership of the Czechs, the leadership of France, and others, of the Dutch, the Danes, and others who have been looking at this for a long time, of the Baltics, of Poland, is that, yes, this is a threat, and it's a threat that's on your doorstep, and you have to do something about it. So I have not seen in decades the people being able to work together cooperatively to rebuild defense industry, to rebuild output. I think France just announced a new upgrade for Caesar production as well, which was very impressive. The Germans are upping the numbers of Gepards that they produce, not just for Ukraine, but for the safety and security of all of Europe. And that, to me, is an upside that we should talk about, that Russia has woken people up and said, this is a really dangerous world, and we have to do something about it. So what's happening here in defense industry, what's happening even to our neighbors to the north who've been a little slow on this, is a recognition that there is a threat, it's not going away, and you have to do something about it. So that, to me, is extremely positive. For Ukraine, this production levels are going to be driven by watching the modern battle space. The war in Ukraine is different than anything we've seen before. So you are now seeing changes in that battle space every 3 months, not every 5 years. So when you change your defense industry now...
In terms of tactics, military tactics,
in terms of, yes, the modern battle space is so different, just the use of UASs in that battle space. You used to be able to look at a defense budget and say 5 years. Well, now it could be that what you were planning on developing is going to be worthless in 1 year's time. And so the lessons that are being taken from that battle space in Ukraine are huge, and they're saving taxpayers, not only in the United States, but in Europe, billions and billions of dollars and euros, because now they know maybe building this cannon and this helicopter makes no sense now because the modern battle space will no longer have that. And so what we've learned from Ukraine in terms of the future of warfare and conflict is huge.
Ambassador, if you want to comment on the Europeans' proposal to get ready for a potential or a possible threat from Russia. Will this be enough?
I think this is a strong step in the right direction. The fact that it's not just the East Europeans, but most of Europe understands that Putin is coming for Europe's vital interests. Yep. Is a large step forward. First, you have to recognize the problem before you can deal with it. I think we've seen clear steps in meeting this challenge. One, as Europe has stepped up its aid in light of the problems with the American aid package. And of course, the bolder things we're seeing from Paris right now also reflects that. But it is true that in Europe and in the United States, there has been some talk but not nearly enough action to begin to ramp up arms production, the domestic defense industries, to deal with A, the challenge of Russia and Ukraine, but B, the possibility of direct confrontation between the West and Russia on the one side or China on the other. This is something that has to happen. But as far as I can tell, certainly the administration has not treated this as a high priority, not the way, for example, they treat the green transition. And this is endangering our security. So that's what I have to say on this. But if I can throw in, well, actually, never mind.
Sure, no, go.
All right.
We can continue, we have time.
I have been critical of the administration, but I have to acknowledge, and it's for fairness' sake, they have put together the right pieces of an overall policy to deal with the Russian threat in Ukraine. All the pieces are there. The position has at least been adequate, and we could do a lot worse than adequate as we watch the isolationists in the Republican Party. The point is that we need to be stronger.
Good message. I want to encourage, meanwhile, our virtual audience. I see some questions that have already arrived, but please send your questions at askac.org. We will have some minutes in the end of this conversation to address all the questions. Ben, as an elected official in France, but who also has spent some time in Washington, D.C., how should European policymakers be approaching the U.S. officials? What messages about Europe's support to Ukraine could be more productive, and what should change?
First, I think we should say that we're all in this together. I was struck when I was in DC in January with European colleagues making the case to American Congress that everything that Europe is doing for Ukraine is not always crossing the Atlantic. If you look at the Kiel ranking, it's not perfect, but it's one of the tools we have to quantify aid. You add military, economic, financial, humanitarian. The truth is European countries taken together are above the United States. I'm not saying this to be critical of anyone, because when it comes to critical military equipment, it's come from the United States. But I mean that Europeans are pulling their weight. We've had debates for a long time about burden sharing, about European defense spending. And once again, I think it's important to communicate that not only are Europeans spending for Ukraine, but they've also dramatically increased defense spending in the last 2 years. Germany is going to 2%. And it's putting 100 billion into upgrading its military equipment. A lot of this may be slow and bureaucratic and frustrating for some of us, but the change is there. France is, over the 2 terms of the Macron presidency, France will have doubled its defense spending. Of course, Poland, the Baltic states, and so forth are considerably increasing also their defense readiness. I think we should do more. We just discussed building a industrial military base. I think it's absolutely critical for Europeans to put much more resources into defense, both at the national level, but also at the European level. Because if you add all the 27 military budgets in Europe, we're second spender behind the United States. Does that translate into actual capabilities, expeditionary means? Of course not, because there's so many duplication and redundancies in procurement and what we decide to develop and buy at the European level. So I think we need to coordinate this much more. During COVID, we considered that we were facing an existential crisis, and we had a huge fund at the European level, a borrowing fund of 800 billion euros to recover from COVID and to invest in technologies and green transition. Well, a lot of us consider that the war in Ukraine is also an existential issue for Europe. And so the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, has proposed another such fund, Euro bonds for defense, 100 billion. That's an idea that we support, and I think would go a long way also to putting money where our mouth is. But I think really communicating to the United States that Europeans are with them and that we are pulling our weight, I think, on this is important. Yeah, that would be, I think, my main argument.
Absolutely, and make sure that the messages and whatever Europe is doing crosses the ocean here in the U.S. Ambassador, what will it take to Congress to pass the aid package?
This is a difficult issue, sadly, and right now, Speaker Johnson in the House has authority to put a bill on the floor. And I think he would like to do it, but he does not want to lose his job. And there's a small group of Republicans in the House naive about Russian intentions, who want to kill aid to Ukraine. And they're threatening to remove Johnson the way they removed Speaker McCarthy in the fall. The reason why I think we will eventually get this aid package done is because there's another way to put the bill on the floor, through a discharge petition, which requires a majority of representatives to sign. Most Democrats are prepared to sign this, and enough Republicans to make this a reality. So I think we will see this happen. But Johnson is now trying to find a magic formula which enables him to put it on the floor without being kicked out. I don't think he will succeed with that. And he'll have to either make the hard decision to risk being tossed out by naifs in his party, or we'll see a discharge petition. But I think we're talking 2 months or even a little bit more than that for this to happen.
What will happen in the battlefield if the aid package doesn't get approved?
I'm sorry, I was in Ukraine 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks before that, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted you, but you'll have something to comment on me. I heard from senior officials their expectation that even without this aid package, they can clearly hold their defensive lines for the next several months, especially since they have aid coming in now, ammunition coming in thanks to President Pavel. But if we're not talking about American aid, in several months, this could be a problem.
Deborah?
So I think between the very good Czech initiative and between what the U.S. is supplying in terms of cluster munitions, there should be enough ammunition to get us to the fall for Ukraine. Once that happens, though, you're going to need more resources and more reinforcement. Now, the United States, there are industries in the United States who are plussing up production, and they're working cooperatively with other industries in Europe whose governments are much more, shall we say, relaxed about having those companies go to work on the ground in Ukraine, which the United States is not very supportive of here. And that will help pick up the slack while our production levels here, Germany and other places that are doing ammunition, can pick up the slack. Having said that, it will not allow for more shipments of HIMARS, for weapons to be launched from HIMARS, because you cannot just pull those out of stocks from ready units. Those have to come from someplace. And then you have to replace them with the Army or the Air Force or wherever they're being pulled from. And that's what that new funding would do. And then it becomes more problematic in the fall. I think there is enough there now, and there were enough contracts signed, and what Europe is doing in terms of stepping up will get us to the fall for Ukraine. I think once we hit the fall, the lack of that funding will really begin to show. And I think that is a really difficult situation. But I do commend my European colleagues for stepping up on this. And I want to make one other point here, which is very interesting. We are looking at that modern battle space and all these modern things. The irony is some of this equipment, like the French César, is very effective because it's older technology and it's less susceptible to Russian jamming. The little ironies here. They can actually do damage where some of the most modern technologies are more susceptible to Russian countermeasures. And so in some ways, you're moving very forward fast into this modern battle space. And then in the other way, you're looking at things that are actually working better on the ground because they're less susceptible to Russian countermeasures.
Ben, back to you. Is Europe, and particularly France, ready to step up if the U.S. Aid is diminished or even stopped? I saw last week that op-ed by the French, Polish, and German foreign minister, who basically concluded, as Europeans, we're ready to do our part. But are they ready to step up in case the U.S. aid will halt?
I don't think we'll have a choice. If U.S. aid is blocked, there are two alternatives. Either we say, well, we can't go on without the United States, and we push Ukraine to a negotiation that de facto will be a capitulation, a defeat. Because if you look at Russia's demands right now, they haven't moved in the last 2 years. Russia still wants to overthrow the regime, still wants to take over Ukraine, not only its territory, but its political and democratic future. That will have dramatic consequences on the security of Europe tomorrow. You'll have Russia threatening the Baltic states and Poland, and the credibility of the European Union and the alliance that will be at zero, and what a precedent it will send also to the rest of the world. Or we find the resources and the political will to take matters in our own hand and be able to continue to help Ukrainians defend themselves and win this war. At the end of the day, once again, we are defending our security interests, not only the security architecture of Europe, but I would say also the very basic sort of everyday well-being of our own citizens. If Russia tomorrow takes over Ukraine, it will control between a third and a half of grain exports in the world. They will, of course, continue to put pressure on energy prices. So it's even the basic cost of living in terms of food or energy of our citizens that will be affected. So once again, either we step up, but this will demand critical choices, especially when it comes to finding resources. This is why I was talking earlier about either a fund, or there's a debate that I and a few colleagues in Europe are trying to push about the confiscation of Russian frozen assets. But in any case, we'll have to find the resources and the will to be able to continue without the United States.
And how about the Czech perspective, if the US aid is stalled?
Look, I've said all over again, we're in this together, and I'm just not saying as a European who's been part of a larger concerted effort here on the Capitol Hill in this town, just to make a case for Ukraine and also make a case for Europe to illustrate that we are doing this together. We've only spoken about the war in Ukraine itself and the transatlantic cooperation, but obviously this is happening in a wider global context with China very well watching and assisting Russia and other countries, North Korea, Iran, assisting Russia in this brutal and ruthless war. So we're talking about the overall perception of the United States, Europe, and other democratic countries, and that's what we have to bear in mind. So yes, the Europe will have to continue their support, and I think we're ready to do that. My country including, we are spending 2% on GDP of defense, and understand that it's no longer about the 2%, but the debate, as we're going to see at NATO in the upcoming summit and other meetings, will go beyond that threshold. But we have to be mindful that this is potential. We are part of a long-term confrontation, not unsimilar to Cold War, but definitely much more complex given the technological development and the myriad of actors present, and both state and non-state, and definitely, once again, and I cannot stress this enough, private sector playing a primary role in safeguarding our values and interests.
And since you mentioned the NATO summit in July, Ambassador, I wanted to ask you, this administration always stresses the unity in its discussions about the Ukraine-NATO relationship. With the NATO summit in DC, not far off, what will happen in Washington on the NATO-Ukraine relationship, and how is the policy being formulated among NATO allies?
Sadly, I have very low expectations for the upcoming summit, the 75th anniversary summit for the alliance. Again, I think we see timidity in Washington and in Berlin that doesn't want to take a clear step forward towards Ukraine's eventual membership in NATO. We put together a proposal in October that was short of actually extending an invitation for Ukraine to join the alliance to begin negotiations for the alliance membership at the NATO summit. We talked about inviting them to accession membership talks, but even that was a bridge too far for the White House. They talk about alliance unity. They talked about alliance unity at the Vilnius summit, which had a very modest result on NATO-Ukraine. But they define that unity in terms of the actors most unwilling to move forward. So it's basically the US and Germany which is setting the pace, which means it's a very slow and doddering pace. if the administration is unwilling to move more in a more stalwart fashion on NATO-Ukraine at the summit, they could use the summit, for example, to announce alliance-wide major new aid package with weapons that they've thus far been reluctant to send. That would be a major step forward. But here, too, I'm not confident we'll see that outcome. So I have very low expectations. But let me make one more point.
Sure.
We should welcome Ukraine into NATO, not just because that will anchor a secure stability across Europe, which as long as Ukraine is not in NATO, they are a target for Russia, but because Ukraine has arguably one of the most effective militaries in the world. Not just because they've stood off this massive Russian invasion, but what Ukraine has done, and Deborah could talk about this with much more expertise than me, with drones, is defining the future of warfare. Instead of the United States, out of timidity, telling Ukraine, do not strike Russian oil refineries or Russian military base in Ukraine, we should be applauding the success that their drones are producing. And Ukraine in NATO will bolster NATO's defense capacity by a wide margin. And that's one more reason why we should be welcoming them in.
Is the timing to say publicly, like Secretary Blinken said it yesterday in Brussels, Ukraine will be a member of NATO? Does it help or hurt Ukraine right now?
I mean, I think that's a pretty loaded question. My inclination is Ukraine should be a member of NATO. They have a very effective military. NATO's a defensive alliance, and you want militaries in NATO to be effective, not just, as Jan said, it's not just the 2%, it's what you do, how you go at it. There's countries who have 4% and 60% of what they're doing is spent on personnel costs. So that's not exactly going to make them a more effective military. So I think Ukraine has already met that need, and I think that there is, I think Ukraine has done more to defend NATO's borders and sovereignty than any other country in any recent memory. And I think that's really important to say. Politically, I think you then go to Congress and you go to other countries who have to ratify this, and then that might become problematic. But I think if you do not telegraph at the Washington summit to Russia that Ukraine has an opportunity and chance to join NATO, then Putin will take that, run with it, and do whatever he can to crush any hopes of that ever occurring.
And what he does when he hears that Ukraine will be a member?
He's going to be upset. But you know what? Putin has lived to be upset for many decades of his life. And you're not going to change his personality by making that statement one way or the other. I'm sure he'll give more nuclear threats, to which my approach is a little more cavalier than some, which is, please try to fire one of your Iskander missiles and see what happens to your troops as you wipe them out.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Ambassador Jan and Ben. I have some questions from the audience, so please, I want to really honor them. Ben, I'll start with you. A French Armed Forces minister said that the production rates of, I hope I'm saying this right, Scalp EG cruises, missiles, must be looked at. Can you say something about possible plans the Assemblée Nationale has to fund production of new missiles, both for Ukraine and for the Air French Force?
Yeah, so first we've announced a $3 billion military aid package in 2024 for Ukraine. That was part of President Zelensky and President Macron signing the security agreement that we voted at the National Assembly after debate a couple of weeks ago. The defense minister has been quite concerned with our defense industry being able to step up, ramp up its speed in its production capabilities. Of course, we need to put resources so that our industrials have the sort of long-term visibility to be able, in terms of orders, to be able to do this. But he's been, I would say quite blunt in the last few weeks, basically saying that he would not shy away even from, I would say, a requisition, basically sort of taking over and putting military priorities over civilian orders for some of these companies. We've had some successes like Nexter, which is the company that manufactures the Caesar cannon, which have been really quite effective on the ground in Ukraine, which more than doubled, almost tripled its production speed. But other companies have not always been so successful. So that's a big priority, is to getting them there, because of course, I mean, not only for Ukraine, but also for us to be able to replace our need. And that's something that, you know, we're looking at all across Europe. That's part of the ammunition plan also of Commissioner Thierry Breton, is to sort of identify where some of our industrials all over Europe could go quicker.
And I have another question, so it's open, whoever is brave enough to answer. What can we do to move forward use of frozen Russian assets for defense, Ambassador?
I spend a fair amount of time, I think, with the single most effective individual in the world on this issue, someone named Philip Zelikow, who has pushed the debate forward, making the case under the legal doctrine of countermeasures, not sanctions, that Russia owes Ukraine a great deal of money for the damage that it has inflicted in this war of aggression. And therefore, it is legal and it is smart politics, smart geopolitics, to use the frozen Russian assets, which now are more than $300 billion worth, to Ukraine. Maybe not all of that to Ukraine. Maybe a small portion of that could go to other countries which have been hurt by Russia's aggression in Ukraine, especially food importing nations in the global south. Yeah. His ideas were considered way outside the mainstream a year ago. Right now, this is largely the position of the US government, the Canadian government, and the British government. France, Germany, and Japan, because the G7 plays an important role here, remain skeptical. I believe they are hiding behind the legal argument when their real concern is that Russia would respond if the assets are transferred to Ukraine by going after the assets of their firms in Russia. Even though my understanding is Total, right, the great French hydrocarbon company, has written off its investments in Russia, realistically. But this is an issue. I think more progress will be made at the G7 summit coming up in Italy in June. But I think there are still lots of work to be done before this can actually be achieved. One last point. The Europeans like to point out that most of these assets are, in fact, under their control in Belgium. But it's also true a substantial part of these, even those under European control, are in dollars, which gives the United States a say. And I think that fact may also be important tactically in bringing the other countries to what I consider to be the right one, which is the right position, meaning using those assets for Ukraine's defense and Ukraine's reconstruction.
Ben, France's perspective on the use of the frozen assets?
Yeah, well, first, European countries have agreed on, which is at least the first step, on taking over the windfall profits that are generated by these assets. So we're talking about something along the lines of between 3 and 5 billion a year, which is a good start, but it's a far cry from the close to 200 billion that would be located in Belgium, and maybe close to 300 billion all over the world. Look, my sense is that it's not so much about potential countermeasures in Russia, because I agree with what John just said, but the risk to a single currency area like the Eurozone, if we were to do this unilaterally. Because the truth is, even if countries like the United States or the UK or Canada have signaled support or interest in doing this, they have not passed legislation to that effect. And even though there's more resources in Europe, a coordinated G7 decision would go a long way in protecting the countries that are more exposed. And I think that's really critical in doing this. And I say this as someone who's introduced a resolution in the French Parliament calling for the confiscation of assets. So I'm very much a supporter of this. But I think if the US, Canada, Japan, maybe Switzerland as well, were to move forward with doing this, I think we'd be aligned at the transatlantic and at the G7 level, which would make it much more secure to move forward with this, because it's it is still an unprecedented step. So there's legitimate concern. So I think it should be done, I think, in a robust and cautious way. But once again, I say this as a supporter of moving forward.
Thank you, Ben. And the last minutes to Deborah for a question that I found provocative, but I think it's important to discuss it. Given that this war is now in its third year, it is not proving intractable. And as such, does an increasing military assistance basically amount to escalating the war rather than ending it?
No, I think I've heard this question asked about 15 different times and 15 different ways. This is sort of, why should we pour more weapons into this? Because it's just going to upset Russia more, and it'll never end, and et cetera. So I'll give you a couple of historical facts here. For people who are pushing for an end to this war and some sort of peace agreement, I want to remind them that in the last 100 years, there has never been a single peace agreement that has succeeded without U.S. boots on the ground. That's any of the Berlin crises, that's the DMZ in Korea, that's Vietnam post-74, it's the Sinai, the list goes on, even with a couple of hundred U.S. troops. And so my question to people who are advising the White House, my question to people who talk about this peace agreement is, do you want U.S. boots on the ground? Because I have to be honest with you, UN peacekeeping forces from South Africa and Pakistan are not going to hold Russia back from taking more territory in Europe. So to me, this is a ridiculous kind of point, because there's never going to be enough for Putin. It's never going to be 20% of Ukraine and just stop. Who's going to stop them from taking more than that? And remember, the last solution that the West absolutely collapsed on, including the United States, was 2008 in Georgia, where they were going, oh yeah, we'll let peacekeepers in, let them all be Russians. There was nothing more ridiculous that I've ever seen in my life. Or, you know, the Russians just changed their uniforms out of the Guards Airborne Division to something else and put on a blue hat. So what I say to that is, no, this war has to be won, because there's no way to stop it unless you want to put U.S. boots on the ground. And I think people forget that historically that's what would have to happen to end this in a way other than Ukraine retaking all of the territory that Russia is illegally occupying.
Thank you very much, Deborah Kagan, Ambassador John Herbst, Jan Havranek for being here, and Ben Haddad, thank you so much for sharing your views and the boldness from President of France, Emmanuel Macron, and the Czech president. I think our title was quite difficult to answer, but we provided some good answers and some tips how the U.S. and what the U.S. should learn. The first thing that I can remember now is not be timid, fight timidity by boldness. And the messages are really clear and simple. A robust U.S. and EU response is crucial, not just for Ukraine's future, but for the future, for deterring future aggression in Europe or anywhere else in the world. Thank you very much for watching us. See you next time.